Hello everybody, it's Sarah and I'm back again. I did not manage to film in the last 3 weeks while I was in rehab like I thought, even though I would have really loved to film, but I was just like always really tired and wasn't really feeling it, so I didn't film. So I am here now, a little bit late but still on time, with my August wrap-up as well as my wrap-up for the NEWTs. I was actually quite doubtful whether or not I would manage to read all the books that I wanted to read. I had to read a total of 8 books and 1 comic, and yeah, I haven't read that many books in a month in over 3 years, so you can see why I was kind of doubtful. And then also, as I said, I still had to finish my bachelor papers at the beginning of the month, so by the time the 14th rolled around and the month basically was half over, I had still only read 1 of the books that I had to read. However, I did finish all 7 other books in the 3 weeks, like actually 2 weeks that were still left in August that I was in rehab, and I was so proud of myself. I am so proud of myself, honestly. I didn't think I would do it, but since this is going to be quite long, let me just jump right into it and start with the first book. So I chose The Career of Aura, and I had to get an O in Defense Against the Dark Arts first, so I had to read 3 books for that subject. The first one was to read a book that is Black Under the Dust Jacket, and for that I chose Spin the Dawn by Elizabeth Lim. I have the paperback version of this book, however I do know for a fact from a friend that this is black under the cover, so I decided to cheat a little bit because I'm not the biggest fan of hardcover books. This book follows Maya, who is the daughter of a tailor, and when the old imperial tailor dies, her father is asked to take part in a competition to become the new tailor of the emperor. However, because of age and sickness, his fingers aren't quite as nimble anymore and he's not that good at handling scissors anymore, so Maya goes in his place. However, she has to dress up as a boy because women are not allowed to become tailors. And then there's also intrigue, there's magic, there's love, there's just all the good stuff that you usually find in fantasy books. It's also, of course, East Asian inspired, which is a setting that I personally very much enjoy. I really enjoyed this book. I gave it 5 out of 5 stars, if I remember correctly. I flew through it. I think I read it basically in 1 or 2 sittings. And I loved Maya as a character. I really loved her character development. I loved a lot of the other characters, especially Eden, I think his name was. I'm so bad at remembering characters, and I read so many books this month, so they're like all jumbled up in my head. But anyway, he is kind of a magician type character and I really loved him as well. And the thing that I also loved about this book is that the story kind of was a retelling, a mashup of a retelling of different stories and legends and fairy tales. Most obviously, of course, Mulan, of the girl who goes instead of her father somewhere and has to dress up as a boy and isn't allowed to be discovered. But yeah, I really enjoyed it and I highly recommend you pick it up. If you're thinking of getting into fantasy, this is also a really good book to start because there isn't too much background lore or world building, I would say. Like, it's not too complicated, so it's definitely a good place to start. So the second challenge would have been to pick the first book that came to my mind in that moment, but that was Cloud Atlas by David Mitchell, and I really didn't feel like reading that book, so I picked the choker book of the readathon, which is Spellslinger by Sebastian de Castell, and basically we were allowed to pick this book for any challenge that we wanted to read. And while I did enjoy reading the book while I read it, as soon as I started thinking about the book, there were so many problematic things that I found that I just ended up giving it 2.5 stars. And it just, I don't know how else to explain it, but that it just seems like a book that is written by a white man. And that doesn't mean that like books written by white men are bad books, but it's just like when you think of a book written by a white man, this would be the book that would come to my mind. Starting from the fact that it is in a Middle Eastern, Arabian setting, Northern African maybe, and there isn't a single person in the whole book that is a person of color. They're all white. And going to the main female love interest, who is the most dull character I have ever read about. She is so boring. She has absolutely no character whatsoever. And lastly, for the fact that usually when you have books and there's like an uprising of people that are oppressed, usually the people that are oppressed aren't made out to be the villains in the book, which kind of happens in this one. So yeah, there's just like a lot of issues that I had with this book, and so I wouldn't recommend it to anyone else. I might continue on with the series and see where it goes, but we'll see. I'm not too sure yet. Next, I had to read a book by an English author, or that is set in England, and for that I chose The Ocean at the End of the Lane by Neil Gaiman, who of course is a British author, and it's also set in, I think, southern England. I'm not quite sure. But the setting isn't that important for the story, and I absolutely love this book. It's kind of very spooky, and I'm not really sure if it's written for children or for adults, because it's like kind of written as if it was written for children or like for a middle grade age group, but at the same time there's a lot of topics and a lot of scenes that aren't exactly fit for children that age. And I don't even want to talk about what this book is about, because basically it's just, you should go into this blind. I did, and I absolutely loved it, and 5 out of 5 stars for this book. It's kind of a theme for the whole NEWTs for me. I either absolutely love the book or I just couldn't stand it. I kind of went both extremes, where usually when I read I give most books like 3 stars. But yeah, I absolutely loved it and I would highly recommend it. Next, I had to get an Ian Charms, so I had to read 2 books. And the first book I read was The Testament of Loki by Joanne M. Harris, and I read that for a book with a gorgeous cover, because look at this cover. And this story follows Loki after Ragnarok. So he escapes his prison that he is put in during Ragnarok, and he ends up in our world in the body of a girl who deals with depression and eating disorder, as well as self-harm issues. So there are triggers for all those things. But I personally still really enjoyed this book, even though there were issues with the recovery of the girl after Loki is in her body. Because recovery from eating disorders, from depression, usually isn't as easy as it is depicted in this book. But then again, when you have a god living inside of you, maybe it just is that easy. Maybe it just makes it that easy. But anyway, I still did really enjoy this book. It's the second book in the Loki duology, the first one being The Gospel of Loki, which is a retelling of Norse mythology from the point of view of Loki. And you can still read this book without having read The Gospel of Loki. However, you'd have to be very firm in your Norse mythology, because you kind of need the whole thing of knowing what Ragnarok is, what happened during Ragnarok, so that you can understand this book. And there's also a second companion duology, which is the Rune Marks duology, which I finished last month, which consists of Rune Marks and Rune Light, which I would also recommend you read before you read this book, even though time-wise this is set before Rune Marks. But there's just stuff in here that happens that alludes to Rune Marks and Rune Light that aren't exactly spoilers, but that just heighten the reading enjoyment if you have read the other duology before that. So I would recommend you read it in order of publication. So Gospel of Loki, Rune Marks, Rune Light, and then The Testament of Loki. And I gave this 4 out of 5 stars, I think, because I did still enjoy The Gospel of Loki way more. And so that was kind of the bar this book had to jump over. If it wasn't for that, and if it wasn't for the mental illness recovery issue, I would have definitely given this 5 stars. And it is the book of both of the duologies that I liked second best after Gospel of Loki. so I liked it a bit more than Rune Marks and Rune Light. The second book I had to read for charms was to read a comic book or manga, and for that I chose the 33rd volume of Shokugeki no Soma, or Food Wars, by Tsukada Yuto, and I did really enjoy it. I enjoy the whole series. I enjoy the anime a lot as well, and I would recommend both the manga and the anime. If you don't mind gratuitous fan service, because yeah, there's a lot of that in there, but there's also a lot of amazing food, and every time I read it and every time I watch the anime, I get so hungry for Japanese food, but we don't have any really good Japanese food in Vienna, which is kind of tragic. Moving on to potions, which I also had to get an E in. The first book for that was to read a friend's favorite book, and I chose, of course, my best friend's Hannah's favorite book, which would have been Name of the Wind, but I have already read it. So I chose Ian because I promised her years and years ago that I would finally read this book. And funnily enough, it's the second book that I read this month and during the NEWTs that is set in an Eastern Asian setting and that follows a girl that hides her identity as a girl and has to pretend to be a boy. And this book is a dragon book. In this world there are 12 dragons corresponding with the Chinese star signs, and each year one of the dragons chooses a new dragon eye, or someone who is going to become a dragon eye in the future, who then basically can use the power of the dragon to do good or evil as well, I guess. And one of the dragons, the mirror dragon, the dragon, has vanished hundreds of years ago, and Iona, as Eon, as a boy, goes to the ceremony where the dragon of the year chooses their new dragon eye, and suddenly the mirror dragon appears again and chooses her, and again, intrigue, magic, all the good stuff. I really did enjoy this book, but I would have probably enjoyed it more if I had read it a few years ago, because by now I have read more fantasy books that are set in an Eastern Asian setting, but that were also written by own voices authors. And by that, I do not think that any author has to write in a particular setting, that white people aren't allowed to write in Eastern Asian settings, that POC authors have to write in a setting that corresponds with the culture they call their own, or anything like that. But I do think, since there is such a lack of POC authors in publishing still, it's just at this point now, if I enjoy the books the same, I will prefer the book that is written by a POC author about their own culture over a white author writing about an Eastern Asian culture, if you kind of understand what I'm talking about. I'm not sure if I used the right words, to be honest. But anyway, I still enjoyed it. I would have enjoyed it more a few years ago, when I hadn't had the chance yet to read a lot of amazing books with Eastern Asian settings that are written by POC authors who come from those cultures. But I would still recommend it. I still think it's a good book. And also there was some stuff concerning gender that I really enjoyed in this book, because there is a character, a quite major character, who is a transgender woman. And I really enjoyed that contrast between Iona, who dresses up as a boy, who pretends to be a boy, who might say she prefers living as a boy, but just because of society, because society doesn't grant a lot of freedoms to girls and to women. So she prefers to live as a boy because that way she has more freedom, and it's also something she has known her whole life, but at the same time she isn't transgender. And the contrast between her and the transgender woman, who of course is a woman, it doesn't matter what her body is like. It's just kind of nice to see, to be honest. So I really enjoyed that. Then next I was supposed to read a book in my house colors, and of course I am a Ravenclaw, so I chose a blue book, even though this isn't technically Ravenclaw blue. and I chose Mort by Terry Pratchett. This is my second Terry Pratchett book so far, and I gave it 2 stars. And it's not because it's a bad book by any means, but Terry Pratchett just really isn't for me, and I really had to fight through this book, and I now gave him a second chance after Colors of Magic, I think was the first one that I read, which I also didn't enjoy too much, and his writing and his style of storytelling just really isn't for me. He's too whimsical for me, so I don't think I'm gonna read any more books by him. Next, I only had to get an A in herbology, which meant I only had to read 1 book, and that challenge was to listen to an audiobook. But I actually pulled a Hermione on this one because we were given another option if we don't like audiobooks, and that is to read a book with green on the cover, and I actually did both. First, I listened to the audiobook of Shadow of a Dark Queen by Raymond Feist, which is the first book in the Serpent War series, and it's actually 2 books in German, which I have here. So I actually finished 2 books off of my TBR shelf, which is exciting. And I also only gave this 2 stars. And this is a fantasy series that was written in the 80s, so I did not expect much, especially concerning the depiction of women in the story, because we all know we can't expect much from male authors from the 80s writing about women, but this even like went beneath my low standards. Most of the time the story wasn't that sexist at all because there were no women in the stories. So, like, you can't really suck at showing women in your story if you don't even show women in your story. But generally, it went the lines of the 3 traditional depictions of women, either the Holy Virgin, or the old hag, or the prostitute, and maybe the mother. Like, those were the only choices women had. But the big problem I had with this book is that at the very beginning, there's a scene where the basically sister of our main character is raped. And she's not really his sister. They grew up together in an inn, and he said at the beginning to just have brotherly feelings for her, but it's kind of hinted at that there might be more and that she certainly feels more towards him. And so he discovers her having been raped. First of all, her description was like really disgusting. Trigger warnings for a second. It's like her skirts were hitched up, her bodice was ripped open, and the author thought it was appropriate to very closely describe how her boobs looked at that second, while her thighs were also bloody. So yeah, the shock of the main character Eric, because it's the first time he saw her boobs or whatever, because that's appropriate again. But mostly it's just him being enraged, and he kills her rapist and stuff. And then towards the end of the book, he is at war and he is lying in the dark, and he just had sex for the first time with a prostitute, of course, and it was amazing. It was a life-changing experience. And so he lies in his bed, covers whatever, and he thinks back to that scene, and suddenly the rage he felt just like is pushed to the back. And in his memory he like really focuses on her boobs, and he gets a fucking hard on, and he kind of like starts fucking masturbating to the memory of the girl that he grew up with like a sister, lying there having just been raped just because he saw her boobs. And I'm listening to it and I'm just like, what the fuck is wrong with men? I'm sorry. Like, why? So yeah, I gave it 2 stars. 1.5 to be honest, towards 2, because the rest of the story was okay, but yeah, that just really threw me off, and I am not sure yet if I want to continue with this series. I might, but yeah, like as I said, not 100% sure. Also, Shadow of the Dark Queen was one of the books that I picked from my TBR jar, and I read a second book that I picked from my TBR jar also for this challenge, and that was a book with green on the cover. This is pretty green, I would say, and it's the third book in the Aguila and Jaguar series, I think it's called, or Eagle and Jaguar series, something like that. And it's by Isabel Allende, and this one is called In Band der Masken, and in English I think it's called Forest of the Pygmies. And I did enjoy this book, but I think I gave it 3 stars. It kind of follows those 2 kids as they grow up. I think at the beginning they're like 11 and 14 or something, and now they're 17 and 15 or 18 and 15. And the first book is set in the Amazonas, the second book is set in the Himalaya, and the third book now is set in the forests of Central Africa. And I do enjoy these books, but they're also kind of problematic, because like this whole story basically is 2 white kids saving the good black people from the bad black people. So yeah, there's like some colonial issues that this book has, but overall the story was enjoyable. But it's just your average book. I wouldn't especially recommend the whole series. I also wouldn't like discourage you from picking it up. It's just what it is. And the last subject I had was an A in Transfiguration, and for that I had to read a book with LGBT Rep, which I actually already read 2 books with LGBT Rep without knowing it, which I kind of enjoyed. However, I do not really count Iona because it's just a side character who is transgender, and the Testament of Loki, the main character, is a lesbian as well, so that I would have counted, but I already had it for another challenge. So I picked up The Abyss Surrounds Us by Emily Skrutsky, which basically is lesbian pirates. Our main character, Cassandra, is a trainer for reckoners, which are these genetically mutated sea monsters that protect ships from pirates. And when she's on her first voyage as a trainer on deck with a reckoner, they are attacked by pirates, and she gets captured to train the pirates' reckoner and to help them get their own reckoner. And she discovers some intrigues along the way, and also falls in love along the way, and all that type of good stuff. And yeah, I really enjoyed it. I definitely want to read the second book. It's a really short read, and it's definitely one that I would recommend, but I won't talk too long about this anymore, because if lesbian pirates doesn't convince you, I don't know what else would. And this video is way too long already anyway, so let's finish up this video. So I did already pick my books from my TBR jar, so I'm just going to show them to you quickly. The first one is Thief's Magic by Trudy Canavan. The second is Windhaven by George R. R. Martin and Liza Tuttle. And the third one is The Two Towers by J.R.R. Tolkien. And we'll see at the end of this month which one I actually picked up, although I think I will probably pick up The Two Towers, because I'm actually already half done with it, and it has been sitting on my shelf half read for the past 2 or 3 years, I think. So, if not longer. But yeah, that was it for this video. I will try to trim it down. But anyway, I really hope you enjoyed this video. Tell me if you kicked the NEWTs ass as much as I did, and if you were as successful as I was. If you enjoyed this video, please give me a thumbs up, and also maybe think about subscribing. All the links to my social media are in the description box down below, so go and check those out, and I hope I'll see you soon. Bye!